hear a story from Matthew. Now, when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And his disciples said, "Well, some of them say it's John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and still others say it's Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven has revealed it. And I tell you, you are Peter," which means rock, "and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Here ends the reading. Before I get started with the sermon, we do have a children's church available. This is a special message for anyone age 2 to about 6 or 7. If anyone is interested, there's a very nice volunteer in the back, and you can hear a message from Ollie the Owl, which is probably more interesting than my message. But either way, you can make your choice. So it's been a busy month in my house. We've had a lot going on. We have 2 new baby girls, Grace and Lily. They were born almost exactly a month ago. And I think I've had just enough time now that I can start to appreciate what has actually happened in my family. We went from a family of 3, I have a son Ethan who's almost 3 years old, to now a family of 5. And any change like that, I think, is enough to get you start to think a little bit about the future and what the future might look like in our family, at least. And it's been interesting doing a little bit of that in the short amount of times I have to do that, because the family I grew up in was also a family of 5. I'm the oldest, and I have 2 younger sisters. And so as I start to think about what our future, what the family might look like as we go in these next 5, 10, or 15 years, it reminds me a lot of what my own childhood was like. And I can remember growing up around this time of year, just as school's getting started again, that I would always hear kind of the same things from my 2 sisters, the same complaints, really. You see, I was probably the worst student of the 3 of us. And so when my sisters would go into school to a new school year, if they had to get one of the teachers that I'd had before, they would always come back to me later and they would complain about our reputation, that I had ruined the good name of Sloss, whatever kind of name that was. They would be frustrated because they would have to work with this reputation that I'd put out. Now, I wasn't, I don't think, a really bad student, but I wasn't the student my sisters were, and they had to work out and figure out how they were going to make kind of their own name for themselves, even with this reputation, this kind of idea that everyone else had about them already. And for me, that was always kind of frustrating, but I have a really hard time faulting my sisters for that. I think just about any of us, whether you're the oldest child or the youngest, no matter where you fall, we kind of know a little bit what it's like to have somebody come up with an idea about us before they meet us. We know what it's like to have kind of that reputation either based on your name or your occupation or what you look like. All around us, there are people who make judgments before they ever know us, and we probably do the same to some other folks too, if we're honest. Now, that's not easy, and we can see it happen all the time. Maybe that even happens because you decided to show up here today. I don't know about you, but it's pretty easy to look around there in my life and to see how being a Christian or being someone who goes to church regularly, that has its own reputation with it. It has some baggage. Especially as a pastor, I can tell you that if I meet someone new and the conversation goes to, oh, what do you do for a living? The moment I say, well, I work in a church, I'm a pastor, usually the conversation takes a very different turn. People have a lot of assumptions. If you want to go to an even further extreme, I had good friends in seminary who were dating while they were in seminary. And if you ever want to end a date really quickly, you can just say, well, I'm in seminary and I'm going to be a pastor. A lot of assumptions come based on those kinds of things. People who go to church, there's a lot of assumptions made about that. Because you're sitting here today, there are a lot of folks out there that will decide that they know what you believe, they know how you're going to vote, they know what you think about certain controversial topics. And it's easy, I think, to kind of point out all of those places where they're wrong. It gets trickier, though, because if you look at just the events of the last few weeks, we see what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. And if you take a survey of the people there in Charlottesville, Virginia, the KKK members and neo-Nazis versus the protesters who are pushing against them, I think you'll probably have more people saying they're Christian on the side of the KKK proportionally than the people who are protesting against them. There's a lot of baggage that comes with saying you're a follower of Jesus. There's a lot of people over history, now and in the past, that have said horrible things in God's name. And I'm not sure really what to do with that. I don't know how we combat against that, how we can speak out enough that that reputation built over hundreds of years of horrible decisions can change and start to move in another direction. But I can tell you that that issue, that problem, it's been going on for a long time. I think that's what Jesus is trying to address even in this story. In this story, there's no church yet. Jesus has just been walking around for a couple of years, and already there's this reputation. This reputation about people who follow Jesus. And Jesus asked the disciples, kind of, what do you know about that? Who do people say that I am? And right away the disciples can point out, well, they think you were John the Baptist or Elijah or Jeremiah. They have all these wrong ideas about who the Messiah is supposed to be, what Jesus is supposed to do when he comes back, how the Son of God is supposed to behave or act. And I'd have to guess that maybe if we were there in that moment, the disciples would have had some other things to say about the people who don't like them very much and how they don't understand what God is doing and how they've gotten this message all wrong. We could go on for a long time about people who say they're following Jesus, but then get it wrong and hurt that reputation and do horrible things. But I think the key to this story is what Jesus does next. After that first question, Jesus hears all those answers from the disciples, and then he asks another question. He says, "Who do you say that I am?" And this time he doesn't get back a whole slew of answers from all the disciples. He probably got back a few moments of silence where everyone pauses and doesn't quite know what to say. I think for most of us, it's a lot easier to point over somewhere else and say, this is what this group thinks about us or about God, and this is why they're wrong, and we can do that all the time. But when the question comes, who do you say that I am? When it becomes personal, when they ask directly to us, it can be a lot harder to answer. In that room with the disciples, somehow Simon Peter decides that he has the answer, and he stands up. And he says, "Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Now, there are a lot of places in the Bible where Peter stands up and he says something stupid and gets rebuked by Jesus, but this isn't one of them. In this moment, Peter actually gets it right. He comes up with the right answer at the right time. And from that answer, Jesus tells him that he's going to build this church. He's going to put in Peter's hands this new thing, this new message, this new thing God is doing in the world. And it's going to be Peter's responsibility to spread that message to every corner of the earth. That's the kind of thing that happens when we hear this question from Jesus and respond to it. This is the question that Jesus is asking us. Jesus isn't just asking us, who does everyone else around you say that I am? The question that comes to us today, who do you say that I am? Who do you say that Jesus is? Who is God in your life? It's not an easy question to answer. In fact, when I was getting my sermon ready, I had a whole lot more things about everyone else who we disagree with that say different things about God and about Jesus. But when it becomes personal, it's not an easy question. We have to dive into ourselves. You have to begin to think about yourself and act a little differently if you're going to answer that question. It's not easy, and yet each and every day there are people who hear that question from Jesus, who do you say that I am? And they find a way to stand up. And they say that Jesus is someone who sends us out to care for the poor and the hungry. And then they go and they volunteer at a shelter or at a soup kitchen. There are people who stand up and they say that Jesus is someone who sends us out in the midst of disasters to rescue those who are lost. And then they get in their car and they drive to South Texas in the midst of floods to try and help however they can. There are people who hear that question and they stand up and say, Jesus is someone who calls us to be together in community, to love one another like family. And then they bring their children to be baptized. There are people who hear that question and they stand up and say, Jesus has called us to share this story of the Gospels, to preach and teach and let everyone know what God has done. And then they get up and they come out of retirement or change careers. They go to school. They become preachers and teachers. They go to work and doing something that they might be terrified of. Each and every day, there are people who hear this question, who do you say that I am? And they reach inside and they find a way to answer it. Those answers are never easy, but every single time someone can stand up and say who Jesus is, a life is changed. You can't answer that question and not be touched at your very core. You can't answer that question and not go out to live in a new way, to do a new thing in this world. It's exactly why Jesus asked that question. He asks it again and again and again throughout the gospel stories, throughout the life of the church, and he asks it again today to each and every one of us. In the midst of a world that's full of chaos and misunderstandings and horrible reputations for all different sorts of people, Jesus asks us, who do you say that I am? As we prepare to go out this day, as we struggle and wrestle with that question, I hope that somewhere in the midst of it, you get just a little glimpse of what God is doing in your life and in the world right here and right now. It's not easy, but as we work to answer this question that Jesus is asking again and again, our lives are changed. We see God at work in the people around us, sometimes in the people and places we never expected. We get a glimpse of a new world, a world that God is making right here and right now. As you go out this day, go with that question. Who do you say that I am? Will you pray with me? Oh, gracious God, you call us to do many things. You call us again and again with that question, who do you say that I am? Lord, sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we don't know what to say or what to do, and yet sometimes, though we know not how, a little glimpse comes through, a moment happens in our life, and we are changed. Gracious God, send your Spirit to us this day. Show us what you are calling us to do, and teach us to answer that question as Peter did, to say that you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Change our hearts. In Jesus' name we pray.